Ache Willow, Season 6, Chapter 7, Time is Money. Tick, tick. Stuffed animals have never had much of a place in my heart. Or rather, I should say that my relationship with them is complicated. Far more complicated than it should be, considering they're inanimate objects. Usually. Thing is, I have this tendency to anthropomorphize almost anything with a face. It's a sort of children's magic. Put 2 eyes and a mouth, or nose, on anything, food, objects, or items, and suddenly it becomes deserving of a name. Failing that, it should at least get respect and the right to live. My parents once went to a fancy dinner, a sort of charity thing. I was far too young to remember what it was all about, but they brought home these 2 dog-shaped bread rolls. One was the vague shape of a Rottweiler, noble and proud. The other had the stature and ears of a Cocker Spaniel. Mom thought they were too cute and smuggled them out in her purse. Each was chipped and cracked, missing crumbs here and there, but their faces were intact, black olive eyes, red pepper tongues and all. I named one George and the other Ollie. For weeks, I kept them on my dresser. First, they dried out. Then, as the weather got more humid, they started to grow mold. Nevertheless, I kept them. Even when Mom made a scene, I hid them in my closet. Only once the mold and age had erased their features did I allow George and Ollie to go to the trash. Even today, I hesitate and whisper an apology if I have to bite the head off a marzipan cat or pig. It's why I don't make gingerbread people very often. The other reason I shy away from anthropomorphic food and items is that they creep me out. Imbuing something with personality is all well and good, but to then have that thing stare back at you, unblinking and unspeaking, it nudges at the edge of your nerves. Or at least it does to me. My own stuffed animals and dolls, those are fine. I know them. Their personality, constructs of my own making, hold no secret or malicious intent from me. All other things with faces, I cultivate a healthy, if childish, wariness towards. Tick, tick. Tonight, surrounded by a couple dozen empty black eyes, all staring in my direction from blank, stitched-together faces, I feel justified in my immature attitude. Or at least I would, were I capable of any other emotion aside from terror. Each of the little horrors, individual animals in a stunning variety of bright colors and species, is holding a knitting needle. Some are thick and wooden, others are thin and made of that gray enameled metal, but all are tapping on the ground or floor with the same rhythm. Tick, tick. At first, it felt like a threat. Move and we'll stab you to death, they seem to be saying with each tap of the needle. Standing there behind the register of pearls of wisdom, paralyzed and cornered, the tapping changed to become more of a countdown. Needles like hands on the clock, moving time forward with every tick. After more than a minute, none of the animals, neither the canary on the counter nor the many cats on the floor, had moved. No more than was needed to tap their weapons. Then again, neither had I. Tentatively, I slid my right foot to the side, careful not to get too close to any of those sharp needles. Like a pack of squirrels, the ones closest to me scamper but are quick to reposition. It's tempting to start kicking and running. How heavy could these things be? A few ounces each? Even with their numbers, I should be able to make a clean break, hopefully without getting stabbed. But that's the thing. Even if I punt all of them away, they're all made of yarn and thread. They'll bounce back and charge anew immediately. Meanwhile, a single stab at my foot would hobble me. A few could bring me down. Not to mention, I still don't have my spoon back. Another minute passes, then another. My limbs are starting to cramp, held in place by fear and tension for too long. Even my fingers ache from the stress. Every minor shuffling of my feet is met with an exaggerated reaction from the crochet animals. They scatter like dropped flour, only to fall back into position within moments. Never do they allow for passage. In fact, with each fresh configuration, the circle draws more narrow. At this rate, they'll be in striking distance soon. Tick, tick. The canary on the counter, the bright yellow thing that stands barely out of my peripheral vision at this point, has moved. With my last shrug, it made to run away, only to come back just a few inches closer. Close enough, it could stab me in the arm with ease. Through the lens of nerves, I feel like every time I take my eyes off one group of animals, the ones out of sight move closer. From my vantage point, on the edge of panic, this is unacceptable. That canary is so close. But when I turn back to the bigger crowd, there's a purple elephant tiptoeing towards my foot, needle raised high above its head. The faint light picks up on the rough texture of the stitching, making the animal's skin look scarred and damaged. Pulling my foot away is enough to send the animals scattering once again, but when they get back into formation, they've once again shrunk the circle. And on the counter, the yellow canary is now well within my personal space, almost brushing against my arm. Like seeing a spider in the shower, dangling from the ceiling, hair-thin legs wiggling in my face, I lose it. I screech or squeal, my hand flying out of control to slap the canary off its perch to fly across the room. With a dull thud, it hits the window before falling to the tiled floor. The needle it held clatters, making a deafening drumbeat that breaks the silence further. Great, I mutter between clenched teeth. There's a second of paralysis, a half moment during which it feels like the entire world has hit pause. Just long enough for me to reassess just how much trouble I'm in. Just long enough to remember that Ophelia could show up at any moment, especially now that her yarn golems have been activated. Tick, tick. Then, all hell breaks loose. Voiceless but furious, the crochet menagerie explodes. The attack on the canary will not go unanswered, and their retaliation is meant to be as vicious as my own. Fortunately, I'm no stranger to crisis. Sure, a failed burglar I may be, and perhaps I'm still learning the ropes as a witch, but there's one thing that has prepared me for such situations. I am a cook. The smell of a burning roux, the sound of a pot boiling over, the ear-splitting screams of an over-eager smoke detector, all are triggers for controlled panic. So many situations in a kitchen cry out for immediate but measured and level-headed response, and that's just the mindset I need right now. The initial wave of crochet warriors is easily knocked away with a sweep of my foot. A few needles stab the floor, missing their intended target by an inch. Before they can strike again, I pull the scarf off of my neck, folding and holding it tight in my right hand. As the second wave charges, I sweep my scarf down on them, knocking 8 or 9 off their tiny yarn feet. They slide on the tiles, bumping into each other. Through this cleared path, I make my getaway. Long strides of my woefully average-length legs get me halfway to the door from which I came, but before I can make it through, a third and final wave of yarn and needles blocks my path. Again, I swing my flannel whip at them, and again, the Technicolor zoo is swept aside. Except this time, they saw it coming. A few of them, perhaps half a dozen, stab at my scarf, plunging their weapons into the flannel, getting a solid hold. Even as I spin the scarf around, whipping at the air and slapping it on the floor, the colorful assailants will not budge. In fact, a few of them, including a peach-colored koala and a teal hippo, have started to scale the fabric, climbing ever closer to my hand, needles sharp under the feeble light. Instincts take over, and self-preservation now overrides precautions about tomorrow. It's between me and the scarf, and although I love it to bits, I have to choose my own safety and survival. With one final swing, I toss my scarf into the shop, sending it flying above the racks and stands to disappear near the front entrance door. The rest of the animals, their martial discipline forgotten for a moment, follow the scarf, hippo, koala, and all, as it sails over their heads. No fool, I take that moment to make my escape. Exploding into the stockroom, it feels like I've not breathed for the last hour. My lungs, arms, and legs ache with every effort, but nothing is wasted in my effort to escape. That I still haven't found my spoon remains a weight at the back of my mind, ever present but irrelevant in the immediate situation. It's back to square one of my investigation. Or if there's a square zero, perhaps even negative squares, that is where I might have ended up. Annabelle damn near jumps out of her own skin as I burst through the back door. Poor girl had been waiting, calmly distracted by her phone, before I crashed out of Pearls of Wisdom and into the alley. I look up at her pale, concerned face, barely an outline in the darkness. But before I can tell her to make a run for it, before I urge her to escape now before my pursuers can catch up, there's one thing I need to get off my chest. That was a stupid plan. The Aquilo Cafe is only a handful of blocks away from Pearls of Wisdom. Like any good business, both mine and Ophelia's shops have their brick and mortar on Rue Principale. It and Main Street, just one street over, are the essential commercial hubs of Aquilo. Walk down either street for long enough and you'll find everything you need and expect from a small village. It's where the market, restaurants, groceries, and church are located. There are 3 banks, a notary office, and a convenience store. On a clear day with few cars or pedestrians, you can see Pearls of Wisdom just by standing outside my cafe. You barely have to squint. Yet, in spite of that proximity, the race home feels like an ultra-marathon. My feet, covered in boots ill-suited for a sprint, twist and ache in uncomfortable positions. My lungs burn with the effort, and my arms and hands still reel from the tensions of being in Ophelia's shop. Those things, the litter of bright, angry crochet animals, aren't chasing us. They couldn't be. Their stuffed yarn limbs would become waterlogged, trudging through their first puddle. Short legs would struggle to cross a few meters before we got to the Aquilo. I can't even imagine how they would open the door to follow us out. But there's something about animated dolls and toys that tugs at a primal string of fear in the human soul. As a child, the fantasy of seeing a favorite stuffed bear come to life might be charming. As an adult that knows better, though, the idea that the lifeless could move of their own volition feels wrong. A simple glance behind would confirm this obvious conclusion, but I'm not ready to turn around and look. Not before I have a door and a window between me and the streets. Annabelle is but a few feet in front of me, but keeping pace. It's pretty obvious she could outrun me if she chose, but instead she matches my speed. My fingers fumble with the keys, nerves making me jittery and incapable of finding the correct one. It almost takes longer to get the door open than it did to run from Ophelia's shop. But until we found refuge inside the Aquilo, the panic remains. Once the door is unlocked, the lights over the counter on, and the ringing of the chimes settled, we finally catch our breath.
Okay,
Annabelle says between 2 breaths.
What are we running from?
Inhaling and exhaling are chores of equal difficulty for a while still, and I can't seem to gather the strength to push out words for a moment. Only after having sat down on a stool, eyes locked on the front window, do I manage an explanation. Stuffed animals, I pant. Angry stuffed animals. Annabelle doesn't answer. Not with words, anyway. She does look sideways in my direction, a clear process of acceptance going on behind her eyes. Eventually, she nods, as if my explanation made perfect sense, even though, as I speak it aloud, I now realize the absurdity of it. They had needles, and there were a lot of them.
No,
She reassures.
I get it.
In my defense, that's not what I had in mind when I came up with this plan. Again, this wasn't a plan, it was just a burglary. She turns and smiles at me, fear losing its edge in the relative safety of the cafe, but nerves still raw.
A technicality. Did you get it?
Leaning on the counter for support, finally allowing my body to relax and my muscles to unwind, I shake my head. It's difficult to admit, but the whole enterprise was a complete failure. Thinking back on all those sharp needles glinting with faint light from the street, I'm just glad to be unscathed.
Damn,
Annabelle says, resting her back on the counter and tilting her head so she can look at the ceiling.
Maybe we can go back tomorrow.
Mother, no, I sigh, exasperated at the idea. If I never have to set foot in that place again, it'll be too soon. It was stupid to think she wouldn't have something up her sleeve, and stupider still to think I was prepared for whatever that could be. She's better at this than I am, and more experienced. I can't even begin to imagine the kind of magic it took to animate all those animals. What am I supposed to do against that? Bake an army of beignets? And what if this is just the tip of the iceberg? What if she's barely touching the surface of her capabilities? Resting my forehead on the counter, I wrap my skull in my arms. The warmth of my winter coat is again catching up to me, dampening my shirt with sweat. Only my neck remains cool and naked.
We're not giving up, are we?
First, I shrug, unsure what to answer. Then slowly, I shake my head, still nestled in my arms. I don't want to give up, of course. It's hard enough to admit that Ophelia is superior to me at something other than making mittens and sweaters, but that I let that beat me into submission? That's unacceptable. I'm Miriam Dufour. I'm the great-grandniece of Doris Dufour. And Doris was formidable. My fingers, still wrapped around my elbows, brush against the countertop. To my right, I can feel the fresh irregularity in the wood, a shockingly deep groove where Gulliver, my friend, shattered his hand. He did it instead of hitting me, resisting the compelling force that took him over just one night ago. No, I mumble, pulling my head out from between my arms. It's a struggle to move any limb at this point, between the exertion and exhaustion, but I want to look at the damage to the counter with my own eyes again. Like crust to a pie, it's the foundation of my renewed conviction. My pride may be wounded, but this isn't just about ego anymore. No, I repeat. We need to stand up to her, if only to pull Gulliver from her grasp. Through blurry eyes, I can see Annabelle smile. Bless her soul, she thrives on optimism, this one.
Great. Where do we start?
I can't remember if I ever answered Annabelle's question, or what conversation might have bled from there. Memory, like a drop of milk in tea, takes on a cloudy form from that point. It first forms into distinct white cumulus, but before the shape can properly register, it vanishes, absorbed and dissolved into the hot liquid. I remember a dream, in that way that we remember dreams, that runs from memory like a rabbit would a fox. Far more an impression of a dream, stitched together by the thread of mixed images than coherent storyline. The cast were all stuffed animals from my youth, including some of the animals I've met in Aquilo. Brioche is there, but so are Oswald, Darling, and Dragon. There are no other raccoons, but there is a flock of macaron sprites circling above. All the animals are made of yarn, crocheted together, their lumpy limbs and empty eyes lifeless yet alive. None have mouths, but all keep asking the same question over and over. They crowd me like Ophelia's yarn golems did, but instead of knitting needles, their only weapons are an incessant question. It's a terrifying ordeal, to be sure, but the dream being formless, there's nowhere for me to run. What now? They demand in unison. What now? What now? What now? And I feel the pressure to answer, but I have nothing to offer. It keeps going, a refrain with each repetition, another link in the chain that holds me there. The only key to escape, an answer I do not have. Then, at the very edge of hearing, there's a sound. For a second, I mistake this steady rhythm for the tick-ticking of 24 needles on a tiled floor. However, it isn't as sharp and far too loud. There's an insistence to the sound that demands to be acknowledged. When I crack my eyes open, still clad in my winter coat, head cradled in my own arms, the sound changes from a steady rapping to that of metal sliding into metal. I blink away some of the morning light, struggling to find focus in the images coalescing before me when I'm slapped awake by a single voice. It's the voice of responsibility and blame, of duties forgotten and promises broken. It reminds me that not only have I slept through the hour of the Aquilow's opening, but I've neglected something else of near equal importance. "Ms. Dufour," the voice admonishes, "I expected more from you." I come down the stairs to a completely transformed Aquilo Cafe. After being woken up by Chef Gagnon and his 2 sidekicks, I went up to take a shower and throw on a change of clothes. It gave time for Bertrand to set up all his equipment, and Stéphane knows enough of the workings of the Aquilo to take over for 20 minutes, even if this is a belated morning rush. Annabelle is still there to give him a hand, having also fallen asleep where she sat. Hair still damp, makeup hastily thrown on. I'm nowhere near camera ready, but this is as good as it's going to get. If Gagnon's unhappy, well, tough. I can't even remember having officially accepted his offer to begin with. Bertrand has done, I hate to admit, a decent job with the setup. Half of the dining room has been neatly cordoned off with chairs, creating an improvised studio with all the bells and whistles. Spots, microphone booms, and more cameras than I would have ever imagined an online production would need crowded into a little corner of my coffee shop. It reminds me of Thomas Sinclair's own portable studio, but on a much grander and obnoxious scale. Then again, Thomas's podcast, Stranger Limits, is usually filmed at his home studio, which I imagine is probably just as ambitious as this. "Miss Dufour," Gagnon calls from across the dining room. Still clad in black, he looks more like a director than a host or even a chef. His voice, always flavored with a hint of anger, cuts through the music, conversation, and background noise of the cafe. There's a constant twitch to his posture, like a man perpetually 2 minutes behind schedule. That, combined with his coiffed gray hair, makes him stand out amongst my patrons. "We've suffered enough of a delay," he continues, marching in my direction. "Time is money, and there's a lot to be done if we want it done right." "I'm sorry," I start to apologize, forgetting for a second my justifiable exhaustion. No buts, Miriam. A production such as ours is no different than running a professional kitchen. Everything is about timing. Every second wasted is a dish compromised. Every moment not properly used is a customer less satisfied. You have to step it up, Miriam. The sauce is burning, the roast is getting dry in your oven. There's no time to tie your apron just right. I open my mouth to speak, but again he cuts me off. Every time he does so, every word that belittles my professional ethics and skill, I'm reminded of who this man was to me. My back tenses and my mouth grows dry, and even though I like to think I've grown as a person since, I can't help but see in Frederic Gagnon the person who might have ruined my life. While I acknowledge him enough to be polite, I bite my tongue and chew my words carefully. I busy myself walking around the counter and taking back command of my cafe from Stéphane. A practiced look at the few occupied tables and a glance at the tip mug are enough to reassure me that he's done a serviceable job in my absence. I shuffle items on the counter and pick up a dirty plate and empty mug, dropping both in the bussing tray under the counter. I straighten the stack of napkins and check the contents of the coffee grinder. Only once I'm satisfied with the state of things on this side of the studio do I turn my attention back to Gagnon. "All right," I say, smiling and professional. "Where do you want to start?" It's difficult to know what to expect. Chef Gagnon, the teacher, would have already exploded with impatience as I went about my business after his speech. There would have been insults and yelling and targeted assaults on my character. Today's incarnation of him retains much of the intensity, but it is far more controlled and focused. This is his show, and he wants to run it like a dictator. That much is obvious. But I think his preoccupations have shifted. Stepping out of the kitchen and the classroom, Chef Gagnon is no longer concerned with the legacy of the cooks he unleashes onto the restaurant world. His pride and ego aren't under attack from students who could damage his reputation with their incompetence. People like Bertrand, or me, I suppose, are now tools for a far greater motivator. Time is money. "Let's give your hair some time to dry," he says, grinning with perfect tiny teeth. "We'll get a few shots of your hands as you prepare and serve food. We want you looking your best for the viewers, don't we?" It's easy enough work. All that's required is that I do what I usually do. Except, instead of serving Ms. Roy her croissant and raspberry jam once, I have to do it 5 times, and at an angle amenable to the cameras. It's the same for everything I do this morning. Every task is shifted just a little so it'll look better on screen. Pour with your right hand. Don't bend down to take out the pastries. Crouch. It looks better. The demands keep coming, and I keep doing as told. Gagnon even gives me a catalog of foods he wants me to make in front of the camera. It's a list specifically curated from the dishes he sampled on his first visit. And just like everything else, I oblige. I couldn't tell you if my docility is due to exhaustion or how both Bertrand and Gagnon cajole and compliment me every step of the way. Despite the constant adjustment and criticism of my every move, their words are always couched in compliments. "You're doing great. These dishes were wonderful. They have to be featured on the episode." By the time the afternoon is halfway through, I'm in the kitchen, working on a balsamic reduction to drizzle in my chicken wraps. It's a small touch, but one that brings some extra zest that can't be beat. "A very clever idea, Miriam," Gagnon says, offering the kind of encouragement I could have used while under his tutelage. "Chicken can so easily become dry without a vinaigrette or dressing. But please, stir with your left hand so Bertrand can get the better shot." Obedient, I switch the wooden spoon to my other hand. I'm about to go through the motions, but suddenly pause. This is wrong. It's one thing to accommodate the camera when pouring coffee or serving pastries, but I'm cooking. "Miriam?" Gagnon asks, his tone insistent. I keep hesitating, watching the thick brown liquid bubble and simmer over the heat. It needs stirring so the sugars don't burn and get lumpy, but I remain transfixed, hypnotized by what I'm about to do. "Ms. Dufour." It feels like being woken from a dream, and perhaps I was. My head shakes and my hand obeys, stirring the sauce once again. There's still resistance, though, a lethargy in my arm as it holds firm to the spoon, a leftover shadow of whatever dream took over for a second. Everything is going swimmingly. Gagnon's promise of mended fences and a landmark episode seem almost an inevitable reality at this point. Every trace of fear that this would turn into some sort of hit piece on my talent as a cook has vanished. This is a collaboration. The episode is a showcase of my talent and skill rather than an assassination of my character. Even though I am drained of energy, relying fully on coffee and sugar, the buoyancy given by the flurry of activity and focus on my work is enough to keep me awake and alert, aside from a few incidents here and there. Clients come and go, and while there's no room for them to stay, all are understanding of the situation. Michael even lingers for a moment, marveling at the equipment and quizzing Bertrand about a few technical points. It's all very boring stuff to me, like the lumens of the spotlights or some other nonsense, but it makes them happy to have the conversation, and that, in turn, makes me smile. It's at about 4 p.m, long after the lunch rush, but before we get busy again for dinner, that Anais comes in. With her, of course, is little Nisha. As it was last time, Anais looks to be in a rush, walking into the Aquilo with hurried steps and concerned eyes. "Excuse me," I say, putting down the platter of assorted cookies I'd been holding up for 10 minutes while Bertrand gets his shot. Now that my cooking is done, Gagnon has been working on his narration, jotting it all down in a notepad. This doesn't stop him from noticing the interruption in the production schedule. I ignore him. Anais makes it to the register just as I manage to slip behind the counter, nudging Stefan aside. He's been taking care of orders and managing the Aquilo while the filming of Gagnon's show takes up my time. If I were paranoid, I'd think my old teacher selected him specifically for that task. But Stefan, while great at taking orders and executing tasks, isn't a master of empathy. The dining room is closed to customers, and he's been instructed to tell them as such, offering a complimentary cookie as compensation for their troubles. But Nisha is a special case. "I got this," I say, grinning at Anais in hopes of reassuring her. Hands on her daughter's shoulders, she tiptoes the last few feet to the register, all the time looking at the transformation of the Aquilo. Her bewilderment is of a different breed as mine. While I saw the metamorphosis as something exciting, she seems apprehensive, almost worried. Nisha, on the other hand, looks about to explode with curiosity. "I'm sorry," Anais says. "This is a bad time." "We're out of chocolatin," I explain, ignoring her concern. "But we have chocolate fudge cookies and caramel peanut brownies. I also have a few things without chocolate, if that's your thing." It's a clumsy way of telling the woman and her child that they are welcome, despite the disturbance to normal operations. But talking with food is second nature to me. It's also a language that children are prompt to understand.
The brownie sounds nice,
Nisha says, breaking away from her mother.
"And an orange juice, please."
I can almost feel the need of Anais to protest, but before she can say anything, I'm already busy getting a plate and napkins for the order. "Can I offer you some coffee, Anais?" "No, thank you. I'll be off again for about an hour, if that's okay." "It's fine." I put the plate down on the counter. "I'll have some ready for you when you get back." The brownie is served and the orange juice fetched from the kitchen. All of this happens under the irritated gaze of Chef Gagnon. Not since the arrival of woman and child did he ever go back to working on his narration, glaring instead at the scene unfolding at the register. He's not pleased, I can tell, and he's about to become unhappier still. Through the day, the production has taken up more and more of the dining room. Equipment, notes, used plates, and props have invaded every table available. The only one to be spared this fate is being currently occupied by one Chef Frederick Gagnon. A table he's going to have to share. "Here you go," I tell Nisha, putting down the plate of brownie and the orange juice. "Try not to bother Chef Gagnon." "Absolutely not," Gagnon finally speaks up, slamming his notebook shut. "This is a workplace, not a daycare." Nisha stops in her tracks, tiny hands clutching her lavender bag like a shield. I pull a chair out for her. "This is my cafe, and Nisha here is my guest. She's very quiet, extremely well-behaved, and will not interrupt our work." "Our work is already interrupted," Gagnon growls. "We are well behind schedule, and time is money," I interrupt. "I know. So why are we wasting time with this conversation? You won't even notice she's here." Regaining some measure of composure, Gagnon flips his notebook open once more. He stares at the little girl like a cat watching a threat to his food. It takes him a while, observing as Nisha pulls out her stuffed animals and guests, but eventually he does bend his head down, putting pen to paper once more. I walk back to Bertrand, who stood silently the whole time, camera in hand, waiting for us to get back to work. Plate of cookies in hand, smiling at my small victory, I go back to the pose I held before the chimes of the Aquilo called out to me. I twist my head to look at Nisha, making sure she's okay and to perhaps give her one last smile of approval, letting her know she's welcome here despite Gagnon's outburst. But the cookies slip from my hand. The plate falls to the ground, first hitting the back of the chair before flipping over and shattering on the floor. Sweets and ceramic explode in all directions, but I hear and see none of it. Instead, there's a silence in my ears. I watch Nisha take out Julienne, her doll, from her bag. Then she pulls out Seraphine and Barbot, the stuffed animals. And finally, adding to her guests, she takes out a new friend, a bright yellow crochet canary. My hearing returns, but not with the sounds of the ache willow. Instead, all I hear is the tapping of needle on tiles. Tick, tick. Ache Willow is written by J.F. Dubow and narrated and produced by me, Amy Frost. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. Want to support the show? Buy us a coffee. Go to ko-fi.com/AcheWillow to donate. Ache Willow has a Patreon. Visit patreon.com/AcheWillow for details. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the username Ache Willow.